In today's episode I'm going to be adjusting my front suspension, and at the same time I'm going to raise my rack. Yes, that's right. Today we're playing with suspension and steering. First job of the day is going to be to raise the front of the car. It's significantly lower than it is at the rear, so I need to adjust that and bring it up to be level. I'm then going to be checking the centering of my steering rack. I'm fairly sure it's off to one side, so I'm going to check that, measure it and make sure it's in the centre. I'll then be finishing it up by fitting these rack spacer plates to raise the rack up. Why do I need these? Well, come with me and I'll show you. So this is the steering rack at the front of the MX-5, and the reason I'm going to need to raise the rack is because when the vehicle is flat on the ground, you want these rack ends to be as close to level as possible. Now, because my car is lowered, when the weight is on the wheels, these are angled upwards slightly, and the problem with that is it can lead to bump steer. So I'm going to adjust my suspension to raise the front ride height, see where we're at, and then based on that I can decide how many of those spacer plates I need to bring them up level. So let's get on with it. So if, like me, your vehicle is equipped with coilovers, you'll be familiar with this procedure, but if you're not, to adjust the coilovers, what you need are these coilover spanners. And the process goes, you've got the two rings, you've got your bottom lock ring and your top adjuster ring. First thing you want to do, loosen off your bottom lock ring without stripping your knuckles, like that. You can now start to wind this adjuster ring up as far as you need to. I'm just going to wind it up fairly indeterminately, and then I'll do the other side to match. And then it's going to be a bit of a song and dance, this process. You've got to adjust it to where you think is right, put the wheels back on, drop the car back down on the ground, check your ride height, and then repeat as necessary. So I'm going to wind these up a fair bit. The front is quite a bit lower than the rear. So I'm going to lock this off now. So you want to get your bottom ring up against your top ring, and then just turn them in opposite directions until they're locked and can't spin anymore. I'm going to measure that, and then I'm going to go and do the same on the other side, and I can drop the car down on the ground and check where we're at. Okay, I've been around the car a few times, had it up and down, adjusted them. I've managed to get a pretty even arch gap all around the car with all the coilovers adjusted exactly the same. Next thing I'm going to do, get it back up in the air so I can look at spacing up this rack. So if we look under the car here, you can see better what I'm on about. You can see how that steering rack end is at quite an angle. Really you want it to be perfectly flat, but I've found the ride height I'm happy with, so I want to go ahead and raise the rack instead. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I want to do is check the centering of the rack, see whether the actual internals of the rack are central in the vehicle. So to do that, I'm going to need to remove the gaiters, which in my case just held on with zip ties. That end's not held on at all, so just pull that off, work it down the steering rack so it's out the way, and I'll do the same on the other side. Now the reason I want to check the centering of the rack is because we've had some difficulty in the past with tracking the car. We've been bottoming out the threads on one side or the other. Also, this car's always pulled to the left despite the tracking being perfect. So I'm going to measure the distance between the end of the rack here and the end of this ball joint. Do the same on the other side and see how close they are. So on the passenger side we have a measurement of roughly 55 millimeters, and on this side we have 65 millimeters. So it is off to one side. The steering wheel is straight, so I'm going to adjust those to match. I also need to find out where the steering lock is, because that's never worked in the dead ahead position, so I'm going to go and fiddle around, clean things up and re-grease these while I've got the gaiters off, and then we can look at raising the rack. Okay, so I've beggared about a bit with the steering rack. I've measured it up. It's now confirmed to be in the centre of the vehicle. I've made sure everything's tight, I've re-greased everything, cleaned it all up, refitted the gaiters with new zip ties to keep the moisture out. So the next thing I'm going to do is unbolt this, the horseshoe bracket which holds the steering rack to the subframe. There's a bolt at the front and a bolt at the back, same on the other side, and then we can get that up out of the way and start fitting our spacers. Right, so to remove these bolts which hold the rack in place, you're going to need a 14mm deep socket, possibly with a small extension to get to the ones at the back. First thing I'm going to do is drench them all in WD-40, because chances are this is the first time these have ever been undone, and they're probably not going to want to come undone too easily. If I could be bothered, I'd wire brush them, but hey ho. So let's get these out. Another one. And that's another one out. So what do you get when you get a rack spacer kit? Well, in this particular example, which I got from Roller Motorsport, you get 4 longer bolts for attaching the brackets which hold the steering rack to the subframe, so obviously these stock ones won't be long enough anymore. You also get 6 of these spacer plates. You can pick and choose how many you use to raise your rack up to the correct angles. Right then, now that those bolts are out, I should be able to lift the rack up. What I'm going to do now, as far as how many of the plates you fit, is going to depend entirely on how low your car is, but when I looked before jacking the car up, it seemed she was still quite low, so I'm going to start off with all 3. So to slide them in under the rack. I'm just going to wiggle a bolt in, try and get those somewhere near lined up. Might be a bit of a fight. Push that up. And just line them all up, and with any luck I should be able to start tightening those ones down. Just want to make sure I'm not cross-threading anything. These are 17s, the new ones. Socket to straighten them out, and I can start to hopefully, or not, thread that in. Nope. one in at the back, hopefully, without too much trouble. He says. Join me when I've done it. Okay, so it took a fair amount of wrangling, but I've managed to get all 3 spacer plates in there. The trick I found was to put the elongated hole of the spacer towards the back, then you can wiggle the rear bolt in and then get the front one in and just push the rack back and forwards to line it up with the hole. It is a bit of a faff to get them in there, but they're in, they're tight. The next thing to do will be to drop the car down and see what angle these rack ends are at. Okay, with the car back down on the ground, I've had a quick look underneath. The rack ends are not perfectly level. I don't think that's ever going to happen at this ride height, but they are a lot closer than they used to be, so I'm calling that a win. The next thing I'll need to do before driving the car for any length of time is go and get the tracking checked. By raising the rack up, I will have induced a serious amount of toe out. The front of the vehicle, the tyres will be pointing outwards, because effectively I've increased the distance by pushing the rack up and pushing the rack ends outwards. So it's very important that you go and get your tracking done first. I'm going to call it for today. I'm beginning to lose the light. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.